Superman Business Head Office, BO. Superman with his cape billowing. Superman in Superman, Secret Origin Number 6, October 2010. Art by Gary Frank and John Seibel. Publication information. Publisher DC Comics. First appearance Action Comics Number 1. Cover dated June 1938, published April 18, 1938. Created by Jerry Siegel, writer. Joe Shuster, artist. In-story information. Alter ego Kal-El, birth name. Clark Joseph Kent, adopted name. Species Kryptonian. Place of origin. Kryptonopolis, Krypton. Smallville, Metropolis, Earth. Team affiliations Justice League. Legion of Superheroes. Superman Family. Partnerships. Supergirl, various. Superboy, various. Superdog, Crypto. Batman. Wonder Woman. Abilities. See list. Superman is a superhero who appears in American comic books published by DC Comics. The character was created by writer Jerry Siegel and artist Joe Shuster, and debuted in the comic book Action Comics Number 1, cover dated June 1938 and published April 18, 1938. 1. Superman has been adapted to a number of other media which includes radio serials, novels, movies, television shows and theater. Superman was born on the fictional planet Krypton and was named Kal-El. As a baby, his parents sent him to Earth a small spaceship moments before Krypton was destroyed in a natural cataclysm. His ship landed in the American countryside, near the fictional town of Smallville. He was found and adopted by farmers Jonathan and Martha Kent, who named him Clark Kent. Clark developed various superhuman abilities, such as incredible strength and impervious skin. His adoptive parents advised him to use his abilities for the benefit of humanity, and he decided to fight crime. To protect his personal life, he changes into a colorful costume and uses the alias Superman when fighting crime. Clark resides in the fictional American city of Metropolis, where he works as a journalist for the Daily Planet. Superman's supporting characters include his lover and fellow journalist Lois Lane, photographer and friend Jimmy Olsen, and archenemy Lex Luthor. Superman is the classic archetype of the superhero character. He wears an outlandish costume, uses a code name, and fights evil with the aid of extraordinary abilities. Although there are earlier characters who arguably fit this definition, it was Superman who popularized the superhero genre and established its conventions. He was the best-selling superhero character in American comic books up until the 1980s. 2. Contents. 1. Creation and conception. 1.1 Influences. 2. Comics. 2.1 Comic books. 2.2 Newspaper strips. 2.3 Editors. 2.4 Aesthetic style. 3 In other media. 3.1 Radio. 3.2 Stage. 3.3 Film. 3.3.1 DC Extended Universe. 3.4 Television. 3.5 Video games. 4 Merchandising. 5 Copyright issues. 5.1 Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. 5.2 Captain Marvel. 6 Character Overview. 6.1 Superman himself. 6.2 Clark Kent. 6.3 Personality. 6.4 Powers, Abilities, and Weaknesses. 6.5 Supporting Characters. 6.6 Antagonists. 6.7 Alternative depictions. 7 Cultural impact and legacy. 7.1 The superhero archetype. 7.2 Fine art. 7.3 Parodies and homages. 7.4 Musical references. 8 Literary analysis. 8.1 The superhero archetype. 8.2 An allegory for immigrants. 8.3 Religious themes. 9 See also. 10 Footnotes. 11 Bibliography. 12 Further reading. 13 External links. Creation and conception. Jerry Siegel, writer. Joe Shuster, illustrator. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster met in 1932 while attending Glenville High School in Cleveland and bonded over their admiration of fiction. Siegel aspired to become a writer and Shuster aspired to become an illustrator. Siegel wrote amateur science fiction stories, which he self-published as a magazine called Science Fiction, the Advance-Guard of Future Civilization. His friend Shuster often provided illustrations for his work. 3. In January 1933, Siegel published a short story in his magazine titled The Reign of the Superman. The titular character is a homeless man named Bill Dunn who is tricked by an evil scientist into consuming an experimental drug. The drug gives Dunn the powers of mind reading, mind control, and clairvoyance. He uses these powers maliciously for profit and amusement, but then the drug wears off, leaving him a powerless vagrant again. Shuster provided illustrations, depicting Dunn as a bald man. 4. The Reign of the Superman, a short story by Jerry Siegel, January 1933. Siegel and Shuster shifted to making comic strips, with a focus on adventure and comedy. They wanted to become syndicated newspaper strip authors, so they showed their ideas to various newspaper editors. However, the newspaper editors told them that their ideas weren't sensational enough. If they wanted to make a successful comic strip, it had to be something more sensational than anything else on the market. This prompted Siegel to revisit Superman as a comic strip character. 5-6, Siegel modified Superman's powers to make him even more sensational. Like Bill Dunn, the second prototype of Superman is given powers against his will by an unscrupulous scientist, but instead of psychic abilities, he acquires superhuman strength and bulletproof skin. 7-8, additionally, this new Superman was a crime-fighting hero instead of a villain, because Siegel noted that comic strips with heroic protagonists tended to be more successful. 9. In later years, Siegel once recalled that this Superman wore a bat-like cape in some panels, but typically he and Shuster agreed there was no costume yet, and there is none apparent in the surviving artwork. 10-11. Siegel and Shuster showed this second concept of Superman to Consolidated Book Publishers, based in Chicago. 12a. In May 1933, Consolidated had published a proto-comic book titled Detective Dan, Secret Operative 48. 13. It contained all original stories as opposed to reprints of newspaper strips, which was a novelty at the time. 14. Siegel and Shuster put together a comic book in a similar format called The Superman. A delegation from Consolidated visited Cleveland that summer on a business trip and Siegel and Shuster took the opportunity to present their work in person. 15-16. Although Consolidated expressed interest, they later pulled out of the comics business without ever offering a book deal because the sales of Detective Dan were disappointing. 17-18. Cover of an unpublished comic book, 1933. Siegel believed publishers kept rejecting them because he and Shuster were young and unknown, so he looked for an established artist to replace Shuster. 19. When Siegel told Shuster what he was doing, Shuster reacted by burning their rejected Superman comic, sparing only the cover. They continued collaborating on other projects, but for the time being Shuster was through with Superman. 20. Siegel wrote to numerous artists. 19. The first response came in July 1933 from Leo O'Mealia, who drew the Fu Manchu strip for the Bell Syndicate. 21-22. In the script that Siegel sent O'Mealia, Superman's origin story changes. He is a scientist adventurer from the far future when humanity has naturally evolved superpowers. Just before the Earth explodes, he escapes in a time machine to the modern era, whereupon he immediately begins using his superpowers to fight crime. 23. O'Mealia produced a few strips and showed them to his newspaper syndicate, but they were rejected. O'Mealia did not send to Siegel any copies of his strips, and they have been lost. 24. In June 1934, Siegel found another partner, an artist in Chicago named Russell Keaton. 25-26, Keaton drew the Buck Rogers and Skyroads comic strips. In the script that Siegel sent Keaton in June, Superman's origin story further evolved. In the distant future, when Earth is on the verge of exploding due to giant cataclysms, the last surviving man sends his 3-year-old son back in time to the year 1935. The time machine appears on a road where it is discovered by motorists Sam and Molly Kent. They leave the boy in an orphanage, but the staff struggle to control him because he has superhuman strength and impenetrable skin. The Kents adopt the boy and name him Clark, and teach him that he must use his fantastic natural gifts for the benefit of humanity. In November, Siegel sent Keaton an extension of his script, an adventure where Superman foils a conspiracy to kidnap a star football player. The extended script mentions that Clark puts on a special uniform when assuming the identity of Superman, but it is not described. 27. Keaton produced 2 weeks' worth of strips based on Siegel's script. In November, Keaton showed his strips to a newspaper syndicate, but they too were rejected, and he abandoned the project. 28-29. Siegel and Shuster reconciled and resumed developing Superman together. The character became an alien from the planet Krypton. Shuster designed the now familiar costume, tights with an S on the chest, overshorts, and a cape. 30-31-32, they made Clark Kent a journalist who pretends to be timid, and conceived his colleague Lois Lane, who is attracted to the bold and mighty Superman but does not realize that he and Kent are the same person. 33. Concept art circa 1934-1935. Note the laced sandals, based on those of strongmen and classical heroes. 34. In June 1935, Siegel and Shuster finally found work with National Allied Publications, a comic magazine publishing company in New York owned by Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson. 35. Wheeler Nicholson published 2 of their strips in New Fawn Comics No. 6, 1935, Henri Duval and Dr. Occult. 36. Siegel and Shuster also showed him Superman and asked him to market Superman to the newspapers on their behalf. 37. In October, Wheeler Nicholson offered to publish Superman in one of his own magazines. 38. Siegel and Shuster refused his offer because Wheeler Nicholson had demonstrated himself to be an irresponsible businessman. He had been slow to respond to their letters and hadn't paid them for their work in New Fawn Comics No. 6. They chose to keep marketing Superman to newspaper syndicates themselves. 39-40. Despite the erratic pay, Siegel and Shuster kept working for Wheeler Nicholson because he was the only publisher who was buying their work, and over the years they produced other adventure strips for his magazines. 41. Wheeler Nicholson's financial difficulties continued to mount. In 1936, he formed a joint corporation with Harry Donenfeld and Jack Leibowitz called Detective Comics Incorporated in order to release his third magazine, which was titled Detective Comics. Siegel and Shuster produced stories for Detective Comics too, such as Slam Bradley. Wheeler Nicholson fell into deep debt to Donenfeld and Leibowitz, and in early January 1938, Donenfeld and Leibowitz petitioned Wheeler Nicholson's company into bankruptcy and seized it. 342. In early December 1937, Siegel visited Leibowitz in New York, and Leibowitz asked Siegel to produce some comics for an upcoming comic anthology magazine called Action Comics. 43-44, Siegel proposed some new stories, but not Superman. Siegel and Shuster were, at the time, negotiating a deal with the McClure newspaper syndicate for Superman. In early January 1938, Siegel had a 3-way telephone conversation with Leibowitz and an employee of McClure named Max Gaines. Gaines informed Siegel that McClure had rejected Superman, and asked if he could forward their Superman strips to Leibowitz so that Leibowitz could consider them for Action Comics. Siegel agreed. 45. Leibowitz and his colleagues were impressed by the strips, and they asked Siegel and Shuster to develop the strips into 13 pages for Action Comics. 46. Having grown tired of rejections, Siegel and Shuster accepted the offer. At least now they would see Superman published. 47-48. Siegel and Shuster submitted their work in late February and were paid $130, equivalent to $2,390 in 2020, for their work, $10 per page. 49. In early March they signed a contract, at Leibowitz's request, in which they gave away the copyright for Superman to Detective Comics Incorporated. This was normal practice in the business, and Siegel and Shuster had given away the copyrights to their previous works as well. 50. See the copyright issues section of this article for more details on this matter. The duo's revised version of Superman appeared in the first issue of Action Comics, which was published on April 18, 1938. The issue was a huge success thanks to Superman's feature. 151-52. Influences. Siegel and Shuster read pulp science fiction and adventure magazines, and many stories featured characters with fantastical abilities such as telepathy, clairvoyance, and superhuman strength. One character in particular was John Carter of Mars from the novels by Edgar Rice Burroughs. John Carter is a human who is transported to Mars, where the lower gravity makes him stronger than the natives and allows him to leap great distances. 53-54. Another influence was Philip Wiley's 1930 novel Gladiator, featuring a protagonist named Hugo Danner who had similar powers. 55-56. Superman's stance and devil-may-care attitude were influenced by the characters of Douglas Fairbanks, who starred in adventure films such as The Mark of Zorro and Robin Hood. 57. The name of Superman's home city, Metropolis, was taken from the 1927 film of the same name. 58. Popeye cartoons were also an influence. 58. The name Clark Kent was created by taking the first names of actors Clark Gable and Kent Taylor. Clark was also inspired by explorer William Clark, especially when coming up with the names Lewis and Clark, a nod to Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, American explorers who discovered the Pacific Ocean. Douglas Fairbanks, left, and Harold Lloyd, right, influenced the look of Superman and Clark Kent, respectively. Clark Kent's harmless facade and dual identity were inspired by the protagonists of such movies as Don Diego de la Vega in The Mark of Zorro and Sir Percy Blakeney in The Scarlet Pimpernel. Siegel thought this would make for interesting dramatic contrast and good humor. 59-60. Another inspiration was slapstick comedian Harold Lloyd. The archetypal Lloyd character was a mild-mannered man who finds himself abused by bullies but later in the story snaps and fights back furiously. 61. Kent is a journalist because Siegel often imagined himself becoming one after leaving school. The love triangle between Lois Lane, Clark, and Superman was inspired by Siegel's own awkwardness with girls. 62. The pair collected comic strips in their youth, with a favorite being Winsor McCay's fantastical Little Nemo. 58. Shuster remarked on the artists which played an important part in the development of his own style. Alex Raymond and Bern Hogarth were my idols, also Milt Caniff, Hal Foster, and Roy Crane. 58. Shuster taught himself to draw by tracing over the art in the strips and magazines they collected. 3. As a boy, Shuster was interested in fitness culture. 63, and a fan of strongmen such as Sigmund Breitbart and Joseph Greenstein. He collected fitness magazines and manuals and used their photographs as visual references for his art. 3. The visual design of Superman came from multiple influences. The tight-fitting suit and shorts were inspired by the costumes of wrestlers, boxers, and strongmen. In early concept art, Shuster gave Superman laced sandals like those of strongmen and classical heroes, but these were eventually changed to red boots. 34. The costumes of Douglas Fairbanks were also an influence. 64. The emblem on his chest may have been inspired by the uniforms of athletic teams. Many pulp action heroes such as swashbucklers wore capes. Superman's face was based on Johnny Weissmuller with touches derived from the comic strip character Dick Tracy and from the work of cartoonist Roy Crane. 65. The word Superman was commonly used in the 1920s and 1930s to describe men of great ability, most often athletes and politicians. 66. It occasionally appeared in pulp fiction stories as well, such as the Superman of Dr. Jukes. 67. It is unclear whether Siegel and Shuster were influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, they never acknowledged as much. 68. Comics. See also, Publication History of Superman and Superman, franchise. Comic books. See also, List of Superman comics. The cover of Superman number 6, September 1940, by Joe Shuster, the original artist and co-creator. Since 1938, Superman stories have been regularly published in periodical comic books published by DC Comics. The first and oldest of these is Action Comics, which began in April 1938. 1. Action Comics was initially an anthology magazine, but it eventually became dedicated to Superman stories. The second oldest periodical is Superman, which began in June 1939. Action Comics and Superman have been published without interruption, ignoring changes to the title and numbering scheme. 71. A number of other shorter-lived Superman periodicals have been published over the years. 72. Superman is part of the DC Universe, which is a shared universe of superhero characters owned by DC Comics, and consequently he frequently appears in stories alongside the likes of Batman, Wonder Woman, and others. Superman has sold more comic books over his publication history than any other American superhero character. 73. Exact sales figures for the early decades of Superman comic books are hard to find because, like most publishers at the time, DC Comics concealed this data from its competitors and thereby the general public as well, but given the general market trends at the time, sales of Action Comics and Superman probably peaked in the mid-1940s and thereafter steadily declined. 74. Sales data first became public in 1960, and showed that Superman was the best-selling comic book character of the 1960s and 1970s. 275-76, sales rose again starting in 1987. Superman number 75, November 1992, sold over 23 million copies, 77, making it the best-selling issue of a comic book of all time, thanks to a media sensation over the supposedly permanent death of the character in that issue. 78, sales declined from that point on. In March 2018, Action Comics sold just 51,534 copies, although such low figures are normal for superhero comic books in general. For comparison, Amazing Spider-Man number 797 sold only 128,189 copies. 79. The comic books are today considered a niche aspect of the Superman franchise due to low readership. 80. Though they remain influential as creative engines for the movies and television shows. Comic book stories can be produced quickly and cheaply, and are thus an ideal medium for experimentation. 81. Whereas comic books in the 1950s were read by children, since the 1990s the average reader has been an adult. 82. A major reason for this shift was DC Comics' decision in the 1970s to sell its comic books to specialty stores instead of traditional magazine retailers, supermarkets, newsstands, etc., a model called direct distribution. This made comic books less accessible to children. 83. Newspaper strips. See also, Superman, comic strip. Beginning in January 1939, a Superman daily comic strip appeared in newspapers, syndicated through the McClure Syndicate. A color Sunday version was added that November. Jerry Siegel wrote most of the strips until he was conscripted in 1943. The Sunday strips had a narrative continuity separate from the daily strips, possibly because Siegel had to delegate the Sunday strips to ghostwriters. 84. By 1941, the newspaper strips had an estimated readership of 20 million. 85. Joe Shuster drew the early strips, then passed the job to Wayne Boring. 86. From 1949 to 1956, the newspaper strips were drawn by Win Mortimer. 87. The strip ended in May 1966, but was revived from 1977 to 1983 to coincide with a series of movies released by Warner Bros. 88. Editors. Initially, Siegel was allowed to write Superman more or less as he saw fit because nobody had anticipated the success and rapid expansion of the franchise. 89-90, but soon Siegel and Shuster's work was put under careful oversight for fear of trouble with censors. 91, Siegel was forced to tone down the violence and social crusading that characterized his early stories. 92, editor Whitney Ellsworth, hired in 1940, dictated that Superman not kill. 93, sexuality was banned, and colorfully outlandish villains such as Ultra-Humanite and Toyman were thought to be less nightmarish for young readers. 94. Mort Weisinger was the editor on Superman comics from 1941 to 1970, his tenure briefly interrupted by military service. Siegel and his fellow writers had developed the character with little thought of building a coherent mythology, but as the number of Superman titles and the pool of writers grew, Weisinger demanded a more disciplined approach. 95, Weisinger assigned story ideas, and the logic of Superman's powers, his origin, the locales, and his relationships with his growing cast of supporting characters were carefully planned. Elements such as Bizarro, Supergirl, the Phantom Zone, the Fortress of Solitude, alternate varieties of kryptonite, robot doppelgangers, and Krypto were introduced during this era. The complicated universe built under Weisinger was beguiling to devoted readers but alienating to casuals. 96, Weisinger favored light-hearted stories over serious drama, and avoided sensitive subjects such as the Vietnam War and the American Civil Rights Movement because he feared his right-wing views would alienate his left-leaning writers and readers. 97, Weisinger also introduced letters columns in 1958 to encourage feedback and build intimacy with readers. 98. Weisinger retired in 1970 and Julius Schwartz took over. By his own admission, Weisinger had grown out of touch with newer readers. 99. Schwartz updated Superman by removing overused plot elements such as kryptonite and robot doppelgangers and making Clark Kent a television anchor. 100. Schwartz also scaled Superman's powers down to a level closer to Siegel's original. These changes would eventually be reversed by later writers. Schwartz allowed stories with serious drama such as For the Man Who Has Everything, Superman Annual number 11, in which the villain Mongol torments Superman with an illusion of happy family life on a living Krypton. Schwartz retired from DC Comics in 1986 and was succeeded by Mike Carlin as an editor on Superman comics. His retirement coincided with DC Comics' decision to streamline the shared continuity called the DC Universe with the company-wide crossover storyline Crisis on Infinite Earths. Writer John Byrne rewrote the Superman mythos, again reducing Superman's powers, which writers had slowly re-strengthened, and revised many supporting characters, such as making Lex Luthor a billionaire industrialist rather than a mad scientist, and making Supergirl an artificial shape-shifting organism because DC wanted Superman to be the sole surviving Kryptonian. Carlin was promoted to executive editor for the DC Universe books in 1996, a position he held until 2002. Casey Carlson took his place as editor of the Superman comics. Aesthetic style. In the earlier decades of Superman comics, artists were expected to conform to a certain house style. 101, Joe Shuster defined the aesthetic style of Superman in the 1940s. After Shuster left National, Wayne Boring succeeded him as the principal artist on Superman comic books. 102, He redrew Superman taller and more detailed. 103. Around 1955, Kurt Swan in turn succeeded boring. 104. The 1980s saw a boom in the diversity of comic book art, and now there is no single house style in Superman comics. 105. In other media. Main article, Superman, franchise. Radio. The first adaptation of Superman beyond comic books was a radio show, The Adventures of Superman, which ran from 1940 to 1951 for 2,088 episodes, most of which were aimed at children. The episodes were initially 15 minutes long, but after 1949 they were lengthened to 30 minutes. Most episodes were done live. 106. Bud Collyer was the voice actor for Superman in most episodes. The show was produced by Robert Maxwell and Alan Duchovny, who were employees of Superman Incorporated and Detective Comics Incorporated respectively. 107-108. Stage. In 1966, Superman had a Tony-nominated musical play produced on Broadway. It's a Bird. It's a Plane. It's Superman featured music by Charles Strauss, lyrics by Lee Adams and book by David Newman and Robert Benton. Actor Bob Holliday performed as Clark Kent, Superman, and actress Patricia Moran performed as Lois Lane. Film. Superman's first cinematic appearance was in animated theatrical shorts first produced by Fleischer Studios. Paramount Pictures released a series of Superman theatrical animated shorts between 1941 and 1943. 17 episodes in total were made, each 8 to 10 minutes long. The first 9 films were produced by Fleischer Studios and the next films were produced by Famous Studios. Bud Collyer provided the voice of Superman. The first episode had a production budget of $50,000 with the remaining episodes at $30,000 each. 109, equivalent to $528,000 in 2020, which was exceptionally lavish for the time. $9,000-$15,000 was more typical for animated shorts. 110, Joe Shuster provided model sheets for the characters, so the visuals resembled the contemporary comic book aesthetic. 111. The first live-action adaptation of Superman was a movie serial released in 1948, targeted at children. Kirkland became the first actor to portray the hero on screen. The production cost up to $325,000. 112, equivalent to $3,501,000 in 2020. It was the most profitable movie serial in movie history. 113, a sequel serial, Atom Man vs. Superman, was released in 1950. For flying scenes, Superman was hand-drawn in animated form, composited onto live-action footage. The first feature film was Superman and the Mole Men, a 58-minute B-movie released in 1951, produced on an estimated budget of $30,000. Equivalent to $299,000 in 2020. 114, it starred George Reeves as Superman, and was intended to promote the subsequent television series. 115. The first big-budget movie was Superman in 1978, starring Christopher Reeve and produced by Alexander and Ilya Salkind. It was 143 minutes long and was made on a budget of $55 million, equivalent to $218 million in 2020. It is the most successful Superman feature film to date in terms of box office revenue adjusted for inflation. 116. The soundtrack was composed by John Williams and was nominated for an Academy Award. The title theme has become iconic. Superman, 1978, was the first big-budget superhero movie, and its success arguably paved the way for later superhero movies like Batman, 1989, and Spider-Man, 2002. 117, 118, 119. The 1978 film spawned 3 sequels: Superman 2, 1980, Superman 3, 1983, Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, 1987. In 2006, Superman Returns was released, designed after the 1978 to 1987 film series. Superman was portrayed by Brandon Routh, who later reprised his role in the Arrowverse crossover Crisis on Infinite Earths, 2019 to 2020. Superman has appeared in a series of direct-to-video animated films produced by Warner Bros. Animation called DC Universe Animated Original Movies, beginning with Superman, Doomsday in 2007. Many of these movies are adaptations of popular comic book stories. DC Extended Universe. In 2013, Man of Steel was released by Warner Bros. As a reboot of the film series, starring Henry Cavill as Superman. A follow-up, Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice, 2016, featured Superman alongside Bruce Wayne, Batman, portrayed by Ben Affleck, and Diana Prince, Wonder Woman, portrayed by Gal Gadot, making it the first theatrical film in which Superman appeared alongside other superheroes from the DC Universe. Cavill reprised his role in Justice League, 2017, where the character is resurrected after Batman v Superman. Zack Snyder later released his director's cut of the film in 2021, to critical acclaim. Television. Actor George Reeves portraying Superman in Stamp Day for Superman. After appearing in film, he would be the first actor to star as Superman in television. Adventures of Superman, which aired from 1952 to 1958, was the first television series based on a superhero. It starred George Reeves as Superman. Whereas the radio serial was aimed at children, this television show was aimed at a general audience, 121, although children made up the majority of viewers. Robert Maxwell, who produced the radio serial, was the producer for the first season. For the second season, Maxwell was replaced with Whitney Ellsworth. Ellsworth toned down the violence of the show to make it more suitable for children, though he still aimed for a general audience. This show was extremely popular in Japan, where it achieved an audience share rating of 74.2% in 1958. 122. His first animated television series was The New Adventures of Superman, which aired from 1966 to 1970. The show also featured a 7-minute part focused on Superboy named The Adventures of Superboy. Starting in 1974, Superman was one of the leading characters in Hanna-Barbera-produced an animated series called Super Friends and all its sequels until 1986. To celebrate his 50th anniversary, Ruby Spears produced an animated series partially based on Superman, 1978, and post-crisis Superman comics created by John Byrne. The model sheets for Superman, 1988, were drawn by legendary comics artist Gil Kane, and most of the episodes were written by comics writer Marv Wolfman. Superboy aired from 1988 to 1992. It was produced by Alexander and Ilyas Alkand, the same men who had produced the Superman film starring Christopher Reeve. Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman aired from 1993 to 1997. This show was aimed at adults and focused on the relationship between Clark Kent and Lois Lane as much as Superman's heroics. 115, Dean Cain played Superman, and Terry Hatcher played Lois. Smallville aired from 2001 to 2011. The show was targeted at young adults. 124, played by Tom Welling. The series covered Clark Kent's life prior to becoming Superman, spanning 10 years from his high school years in Smallville to his early life in Metropolis. Although Clark engages in heroics, he doesn't wear a costume, nor does he call himself Superboy. Rather, he relies on misdirection and his blinding speed to avoid being recognized. Later seasons find him becoming a public hero called the Red Blue Blur, eventually shortened to the Blur, in a proto-Justice League before taking on the mantle of Superman. Superman, the animated series, with the voice of Tim Daly on the main character, Aired from 1996 to 2000. After the show's cancellation, this version of Superman appeared in the sequel shows Batman Beyond, voiced by Christopher McDonald, aired from 1999 to 2001, and Justice League and Justice League Unlimited, voiced by George Newbern, which ran from 2001 to 2006. All of these shows were produced by Bruce Timm. This was the most successful and longest-running animated version of Superman. 115. In the Arrowverse, the main Superman, played by Tyler Hoechlin, appears as a guest star in several television series: Supergirl, The Flash, Arrow, and Legends of Tomorrow. A Supergirl spin-off, Superman and Lois, premiered on February 23, 2021. Video games. Main article: List of Superman video games. The first electronic game was simply titled Superman, and released in 1979 for the Atari 2600. The last game fully centered on Superman was the adaptation of Superman Returns in 2006. From 2006 to present, Superman appeared in a co-starring role, such as the Injustice game series, 2013-present. Merchandising. DC Comics trademarked the Superman chest logo in August 1938. 125. Jack Leibowitz established Superman Incorporated in October 1939 to develop the franchise beyond the comic books. 51. Superman Incorporated merged with DC Comics in October 1946. 126. After DC Comics merged with Warner Communications in 1967, licensing for Superman was handled by the Licensing Corporation of America. 127. The Licensing Letter, an American market research firm, estimated that Superman licensed merchandise made $634 million in sales globally in 2018. 43.3% of this revenue came from the North American market. For comparison, in the same year, Spider-Man merchandise made $1.075 billion and Star Wars merchandise made $1.923 billion globally. 128. The earliest paraphernalia appeared in 1939, a button proclaiming membership in the Supermen of America Club. The first toy was a wooden doll in 1939 made by the Ideal Novelty and Toy Company. 129. Superman number 5, May 1940, carried an advertisement for a crypto ray gun, which was a gun-shaped device that could project images on a wall. 130. The majority of Superman merchandise is targeted at children, but since the 1970s, adults have been increasingly targeted because the comic book readership has gotten older. 131. During World War II, Superman was used to support the war effort. Action Comics and Superman carried messages urging readers to buy war bonds and participate in scrap drives. 132. Copyright issues. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Main article: Copyright lawsuits by Superman's creators. In a contract dated March 1, 1938, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster gave away the copyright to Superman to their employer, DC Comics, then known as Detective Comics Incorporated B, prior to Superman's first publication in April. Contrary to popular perception, the $130 that DC Comics paid them was for their first Superman story, not the copyright to the character, that they gave away for free. This was normal practice in the comic magazine industry, and they had done the same with their previous published works, Slam Bradley, Dr. Occult, etc. 50, but Superman became far more popular and valuable than they anticipated, and they much regretted giving him away. 133, DC Comics retained Siegel and Shuster, and they were paid well because they were popular with the readers. 134. Between 1938 and 1947, DC Comics paid them together over $400,000, equivalent to $6,210,000 in 2020. 135-136. Siegel wrote most of the magazine and daily newspaper stories until he was conscripted into the army in 1943, whereupon the task was passed to ghostwriters. 137-138. While Siegel was serving in Hawaii, DC Comics published a story featuring a child version of Superman called Superboy, which was based on a script Siegel had submitted several years before. Siegel was furious because DC Comics did this without having bought the character. 139. After Siegel's discharge from the Army, he and Shuster sued DC Comics in 1947 for the rights to Superman and Superboy. The judge ruled that Superman belonged to DC Comics, but that Superboy was a separate entity that belonged to Siegel. Siegel and Shuster settled out of court with DC Comics, which paid the pair $94,013.16, equivalent to $1,012,660 in 2020, in exchange for the full rights to both Superman and Superboy. 140. DC Comics then fired Siegel and Shuster. 141. DC Comics rehired Jerry Siegel as a writer in 1957. In 1965, Siegel and Shuster attempted to regain rights to Superman using the renewal option in the Copyright Act of 1909, but the court ruled Siegel and Shuster had transferred the renewal rights to DC Comics in 1938. Siegel and Shuster appealed, but the appeals court upheld this decision. DC Comics fired Siegel when he filed this second lawsuit. In 1975, Siegel and a number of other comic book writers and artists launched a public campaign for better compensation and treatment of comic creators. Warner Brothers agreed to give Siegel and Shuster a yearly stipend, full medical benefits, and credit their names in all future Superman productions in exchange for never contesting ownership of Superman. Siegel and Shuster upheld this bargain. 3. Shuster died in 1992. DC Comics offered Shuster's heirs a stipend in exchange for never challenging ownership of Superman, which they accepted for some years. 140. Siegel died in 1996. His heirs attempted to take the rights to Superman using the termination provision of the Copyright Act of 1976. DC Comics negotiated an agreement wherein it would pay the Siegel heirs several $1 million and a yearly stipend of $500,000 in exchange for permanently granting DC the rights to Superman. DC Comics also agreed to insert the line by special arrangement with the Jerry Siegel family in all future Superman productions. 142. The Siegels accepted DC's offer in an October 2001 letter. 140. Copyright lawyer and movie producer Mark Toberoff then struck a deal with the heirs of both Siegel and Shuster to help them get the rights to Superman in exchange for signing the rights over to his production company, Pacific Pictures. Both groups accepted. The Siegel heirs called off their deal with DC Comics and in 2004 sued DC for the rights to Superman and Superboy. In 2008, the judge ruled in favor of the Siegels. DC Comics appealed the decision, and the appeals court ruled in favor of DC, arguing that the October 2001 letter was binding. In 2003, the Shuster heirs served a termination notice for Shuster's grant of his half of the copyright to Superman. DC Comics sued the Shuster heirs in 2010, and the court ruled in DC's favor on the grounds that the 1992 agreement with the Shuster heirs barred them from terminating the grant. 140. Under current U.S. copyright law, Superman is due to enter the public domain in 2033. 143c, however, this will only apply, at first, to the character as he is depicted in Action Comics #1, which was published in 1938. Versions of him with later developments, such as his power of heat vision, introduced in 1949, may persist under copyright until the works they were introduced in enter the public domain themselves. 144. Supporting characters such as Jimmy Olsen and Supergirl will also lapse into the public domain at later dates, as these characters did not appear in the earliest Superman publications. Captain Marvel. See also, National Comics Publications v. Fawcett Publications. Superman's success immediately begat a wave of imitations. The most successful of these at this early age was Captain Marvel, first published by Fawcett Comics in December 1939. Captain Marvel had many similarities to Superman: Herculean strength, invulnerability, the ability to fly, a cape, a secret identity, and a job as a journalist. DC Comics filed a lawsuit against Fawcett Comics for copyright infringement. The trial began in March 1948 after 7 years of discovery. The judge ruled that Fawcett had indeed infringed on Superman. However, the judge also found that the copyright notices that appeared with the Superman newspaper strips did not meet the technical standards of the Copyright Act of 1909 and were therefore invalid. Furthermore, since the newspaper strips carried stories adapted from Action Comics, the judge ruled that DC Comics had effectively abandoned the copyright to the Action Comics stories and Superman, and therefore forfeited its right to sue Fawcett for copyright infringement. 140. DC Comics appealed this decision. The appeals court ruled that unintentional mistakes in the copyright notices of the newspaper strips did not invalidate the copyrights. Furthermore, Fawcett knew that DC Comics never intended to abandon the copyrights, and therefore Fawcett's infringement was not an innocent misunderstanding, and therefore Fawcett owed damages to DC Comics. The appeals court remanded the case back to the lower court to determine how much Fawcett owed in damages. 140. At that point, Fawcett Comics decided to settle out of court with DC Comics. Fawcett paid DC Comics $400,000, equivalent to $3,869,154 in 2020, and agreed to stop publishing Captain Marvel. The last Captain Marvel story from Fawcett Comics was published in September 1953. 145, DC licensed in 1972, and eventually acquired by 1991. The intellectual property rights to Captain Marvel, today marketed under the title Shazam. 146. Character Overview. This section details the most consistent elements of the Superman narrative in the myriad stories published since 1938. Superman himself. In Action Comics number 1, 1938. Superman is born on an alien world to a technologically advanced species that resembles humans. Shortly after he is born, his planet is destroyed in a natural cataclysm, but Superman's scientist father foresaw the calamity and saves his baby son by sending him to Earth in a small spaceship. The ship, sadly, is too small to carry anyone else, so Superman's parents stay behind and die. The earliest newspaper strips named the planet Krypton, the baby Kal-El, and his biological parents Jor-El and Laura. 147, their names were changed to Jor-El and Laura in a 1942 spin-off novel by George Lowther. 148, the ship lands in the American countryside, where the baby is discovered by the Kents, a farming couple. The Kents name the boy Clark and raise him in a farming community. A 1947 episode of the radio serial places this unnamed community in Iowa. 149, it is named Smallville in Superboy number 2, June 1949. The 1978 Superman movie placed it in Kansas, as have most Superman stories since. 150, New Adventures of Superboy number 22, October 1981, places it in Maryland. In Action Comics number 1 and most stories before 1986, Superman's powers begin developing in infancy. From 1944 to 1986, DC Comics regularly published stories of Superman's childhood and adolescent adventures, when he called himself Superboy. From 1986 on, beginning with Man of Steel number 1, Superman's powers emerged more slowly and he began his superhero career as an adult. The Kents teach Clark he must conceal his otherworldly origins and use his fantastic powers to do good. Clark creates the costumed identity of Superman so as to protect his personal privacy and the safety of his loved ones. As Clark Kent, he wears eyeglasses to disguise his face and wears his Superman costume underneath his clothes so that he can change at a moment's notice. To complete this disguise, Clark avoids violent confrontation, preferring to slip away and change into Superman when danger arises, and he suffers occasional ridicule for his apparent cowardice. In Superboy number 78, 1960, Superboy makes his costume out of the indestructible blankets found in the ship he came to Earth in. In Man of Steel number 1, 1986, Martha Kent makes the costume from human-manufactured cloth, and it is rendered indestructible by an aura that Superman projects. The S on Superman's chest at first was simply an initial for Superman. When writing the script for the 1978 movie, Tom Mankiewicz made it Superman's Kryptonian family crest. 151. This was carried over into some comic book stories and later movies, such as Man of Steel. In the comic story Superman, Birthright, the crest is described as an old Kryptonian symbol for hope. Clark works as a newspaper journalist. In the earliest stories, he worked for the Daily Star, but the second episode of the radio serial changed this to the Daily Planet. In comics from the early 1970s, Clark worked as a television journalist, an attempt to modernize the character. However, for the 1978 movie, the producers chose to make Clark a newspaper journalist again because that was how most of the public thought of him. 152. The first story in which Superman dies was published in Superman number 149, 1961, in which he is murdered by Lex Luthor by means of kryptonite. This story was imaginary and thus was ignored in subsequent books. In Superman number 188, April 1966, Superman is killed by kryptonite radiation but is revived in the same issue by one of his android doppelgangers. In the 1990s, the death and return of Superman story arc, after a deadly battle with Doomsday, Superman died in Superman number 75, January 1993. He was later revived by the Eradicator using Kryptonian technology. In Superman number 52, May 2016, Superman is killed by kryptonite poisoning, and this time he is not resurrected, but replaced by the Superman of an alternate timeline. Superman maintains a secret hideout called the Fortress of Solitude, which is located somewhere in the Arctic. Here, Superman keeps a collection of mementos and a laboratory for science experiments. In Action Comics number 241, the Fortress of Solitude is a cave in a mountain, sealed with a very heavy door that is opened with a gigantic key too heavy for anyone but Superman to use. In the 1978 movie, the Fortress of Solitude is a structure made out of crystal. The movie Man of Steel portrays the fortress as a Kryptonian exploratory craft buried deep beneath rock and ice. Clark Kent. Clark Kent redirects here. For other uses, see Clark Kent, disambiguation. Superman's secret identity is Clark Joseph Kent, a reporter for the Daily Planet. Although his name and history were taken from his early life with his adoptive Earth parents, everything about Clark was staged for the benefit of his alternate identity. As a reporter for the Daily Planet, he receives late-breaking news before the general public, has a plausible reason to be present at crime scenes, and need not strictly account for his whereabouts as long as he makes his story deadlines. He sees his job as a journalist as an extension of his Superman responsibilities, bringing truth to the forefront and fighting for the little guy. He believes that everybody has the right to know what is going on in the world, regardless of who is involved. 153. To deflect suspicion that he is Superman, Clark Kent adopted a largely passive and introverted personality with conservative mannerisms, a higher-pitched voice, and a slight slouch. This personality is typically described as mild-mannered, perhaps most famously by the opening narration of Max Fleischer's Superman animated theatrical shorts. These traits extended into Clark's wardrobe, which typically consists of a bland-colored business suit, a red necktie, black-rimmed glasses, combed-back hair, and occasionally a fedora. Clark wears his Superman costume underneath his street clothes, allowing easy changes between the two personae and the dramatic gesture of ripping open his shirt to reveal the familiar S emblem when called into action. His hair will also change with the costume change, with Superman sporting a small curl or spit curl on his forehead. Superman usually stores his Clark Kent clothing compressed in a secret pouch within his cape. 154, though some stories have shown him leaving his clothes in some covert location, such as the Daily Planet storeroom 155, for later retrieval. As Superman's alter ego, the personality, concept, and name of Clark Kent have become ingrained in popular culture as well, becoming synonymous with secret identities and innocuous fronts for ulterior motives and activities. In 1992, Superman co-creator Joe Shuster told the Toronto Star that the name derived from 1930s cinematic leading men Clark Gable and Ken Taylor, but the persona from bespectacled silent film comic Harold Lloyd and himself. 156. Clark's middle name is given variously as either Joseph, Jerome, or Jonathan, all being allusions to creators Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Personality. In the original Siegel and Shuster stories, Superman's personality is rough and aggressive. He often uses excessive force and terror against criminals, on some occasions even killing them. This came to an end in late 1940 when new editor Whitney Ellsworth instituted a code of conduct for his characters to follow, banning Superman from ever killing. 157. The character was softened and given a sense of humanitarianism. Ellsworth's code, however, is not to be confused with the Comics Code, which was created in 1954 by the Comics Code Authority and ultimately abandoned by every major comic book publisher by the early 21st century. 158. In his first appearances, Superman was considered a vigilante by the authorities, being fired upon by the National Guard as he raised a slum so that the government would create better housing conditions for the poor. By 1942, however, Superman was working side by side with the police. 159-160. Today, Superman is commonly seen as a brave and kind-hearted hero with a strong sense of justice, morality, and righteousness. He adheres to an unwavering moral code instilled in him by his adoptive parents. 161. His commitment to operating within the law has been an example to many citizens and other heroes, but has stirred resentment and criticism among others, who refer to him as the Big Blue Boy Scout. Superman can be rather rigid in this trait, causing tensions in the superhero community. 162. This was most notable with Wonder Woman, one of his closest friends, after she killed Maxwell Lord. 162. Booster Gold had an initial icy relationship with the Man of Steel, but grew to respect him. 163. Having lost his home world of Krypton, Superman is very protective of Earth. 164, and especially of Clark Kent's family and friends. This same loss, combined with the pressure of using his powers responsibly, has caused Superman to feel lonely on Earth, despite having his friends and parents. Previous encounters with people he thought to be fellow Kryptonians, Power Girl 165, and Mon-El 166, have led to disappointment. The arrival of Supergirl, who has been confirmed to be his cousin from Krypton, relieved this loneliness somewhat. 167. Superman's Fortress of Solitude acts as a place of solace for him in times of loneliness and despair. 168. Powers, abilities, and weaknesses. The catalogue of Superman's abilities and his strength has varied considerably over the vast body of Superman fiction released since 1938. Since Action Comics number 1, 1938, Superman has superhuman strength. The cover of Action Comics number 1 shows him effortlessly lifting a car over his head. Another classic feat of strength on Superman's part is breaking steel chains. In some stories, he is strong enough to shift the orbits of planets 169, and crush coal into diamond with his hands. Since Act